The termination letter was already signed before Raymond Aldred even made it to the parking lot. He didn't run, he didn't argue. He just picked up the small cardboard box from his desk. The one holding a framed photo of his son, a half-empty bottle of ibuprofen, and a drawing of a spaceship that 8-year-old Benji had made him for Father's Day. And he walked out of North Point Medical Devices, through the glass lobby doors, without looking back at anyone. The security guard, a quiet man named George, who had worked the front desk for 11 years, held the door open for him. Neither of them said anything. Sometimes silence is the most honest thing two people can offer each other. Outside, the Chicago wind hit Raymond like a cold hand to the face. He stood in the visitor parking lot, because they had already deactivated his employee badge before he reached the elevator, and stared at his car for a long moment before he remembered how to move his legs. He had given North Point 14 years. 14 years of solving the problems that kept the company alive. Raymond Aldred was a biomedical engineer by training, but a fixer by nature. He was the man you called at 11 o'clock on a Sunday night, when the pressure calibration on a ventilator prototype failed 2 days before an FDA review. He was the one who stayed until 4 in the morning rewriting code that someone else had broken, then showed up again at 7 without complaining, because the work mattered to him. Medical devices kept people breathing. That meant something. What didn't mean something, apparently, was 14 years. The official reason listed on the termination paperwork was restructuring. But Raymond knew the real reason. 3 weeks earlier, in a quarterly review meeting, he had told the VP of Product Development, in front of 6 executives and 2 board members, that the new cardiac monitor design had a sensor calibration flaw that could produce false readings under low battery conditions. He had the data. He had run the tests himself on his own time. He had put together a 12-page report with graphs. The VP, a man named Stafford who wore cufflinks to internal meetings and had never personally built anything in his life, looked at the report for approximately 45 seconds and said the timeline was too important to revisit the design at this stage. Raymond said patients could be harmed. The room went very quiet. 3 weeks later, Raymond was handing in his badge. He sat in his car for almost 20 minutes before starting the engine. Not because he was devastated, though he was, but because he had to figure out the logistics. It was a Tuesday. Benji got out of school at 3:15. Raymond needed to call the after-school program to let them know he'd be picking Benji up himself today. He needed to check the refrigerator situation at home, because he hadn't gone grocery shopping since the weekend, and the weekend had been rough. He needed to think about health insurance, because Benji's asthma medication cost $412 a month without coverage, and they had used the last refill 2 weeks ago. He needed to think about all of this before he let himself feel anything. That was how Raymond had survived the last 4 years. Logistics first, grief later, usually much later, usually around 2 in the morning, when the apartment was quiet and Benji was asleep, and Raymond sat at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee doing math on a notepad. Bills, medication costs, the car payment that was 3 weeks out, the school field trip fee he kept forgetting to send in. His wife, Claire, had died 4 years ago from a pulmonary embolism that came without warning on a Wednesday afternoon. She had been 34 years old, and completely healthy, as far as anyone knew. She'd gone into the hospital with what felt like a pulled muscles in her left leg, and she never came home. Raymond had been at work when it happened. He had been in the middle of a product test. He hadn't answered the first call from the hospital because he was in a clean room, and his phone was in his bag outside the door. By the time he called back, there was nothing left to do except drive there, and sit beside her, and try to understand something that had no reasonable explanation. Benji had been 4 years old. He didn't fully understand what happened. For months afterward, he asked Raymond if Mommy was coming back from the hospital soon. Raymond always answered the same way, "Not this time, buddy," because every therapist he spoke to said not to use the word gone with a child that age. But he never found a better word. Not this time implied another time. But there was no better option in a language that doesn't have the right words for explaining death to a 4-year-old at bedtime. So Raymond worked. He worked because it kept his brain moving forward instead of backward. He worked because it paid for the apartment, and the medication, and the after-school program, and the small things that Benji needed the way all kids need things. New sneakers, a Halloween costume, a backpack that zipped properly. He worked long hours and late nights, and he told himself it was temporary, that once things stabilized he would slow down, that Benji was young enough that the time he missed now could be made up later. But time doesn't work that way, and some part of Raymond knew it. He knew it on the evenings he arrived to pick Benji up from the after-school program at 10 minutes to 6, right before they locked the doors, and found his son sitting at the table nearest the window, watching the parking lot. Raymond always waved from across the glass. Benji always waved back with both hands, that whole body kind of wave, that small children do before they learn to be restrained about things. But there was something in the way the boy had positioned himself at that window. Deliberately, like someone who had been waiting a long time, and had learned to get comfortable with waiting. That Raymond couldn't stop seeing when he closed his eyes at night. One Thursday in February, he arrived 7 minutes late because a meeting had run over, and the train had held at Fullerton, for no reason anyone announced. The program coordinator, a kind woman named Terry, who had never once made him feel bad about anything, met him at the door with a look on her face that he recognized. "He did okay," she said. "He just cried a little around 5:30. He was worried." Raymond found Benji sitting on the floor of the coat room with his backpack still on, hugging his knees. The boy looked up at him with eyes that were red at the edges, but dry by now, the way eyes look after someone has been crying, and then carefully stopped so that nobody would see. "Hey buddy," Raymond said, getting down on one knee. "I thought you forgot," Benji said. Raymond didn't answer right away. He put his hand on the side of Benji's face the way Claire used to do. She had always used her whole palm, gently, like she was checking for a fever that was actually just love. And he stayed like that on the floor of the coat room for a minute, not saying anything useful. He had not forgotten, he had never forgotten, not once in 4 years, but he was starting to understand that to a child sitting alone at a window at 5:30 in February, the difference between forgotten and just very late was not a meaningful distinction. He resigned the following Monday. And then 3 weeks later, they fired him anyway, which saved him the awkward 2 weeks' notice conversation, but didn't feel particularly like a win. The day he was let go, Raymond picked Benji up from school himself for the first time in almost 2 years. He was standing outside the building at 3:10, before the bell rang, which almost never happened. Benji came through the double doors, with his coat half unzipped, and his backpack hanging off one shoulder, and his face doing the thing it did when he was thinking hard about something. A small furrow between his eyebrows that Raymond recognized from Claire's face in photographs, the same crease in the same spot, the thing that grief does sometimes, sending you reminders in the least expected faces. When Benji saw Raymond standing there, he stopped completely, like a small system that had received an unexpected input and needed a moment to process. Then he ran. He hit Raymond at full speed the way 8-year-olds do, wrapping both arms around Raymond's waist and squeezing with everything he had, and Raymond stood there in front of the school and held on and did not cry, but it was genuinely close. "How come you're here?" Benji asked into Raymond's jacket. "Because I wanted to be," Raymond said. That was the truest thing he had said in a long time. The weeks that followed were not easy, but they were real in a way that Raymond's life had stopped being. He picked up freelance consulting work, nothing glamorous, mostly helping small medical device startups troubleshoot regulatory paperwork and prototype issues, and he scheduled it around Benji's school day. He made breakfast in the morning instead of pouring cereal and running. He learned, badly at first, and then less badly, how to help Benji with third-grade math homework, which had apparently changed significantly since Raymond was in 3rd grade. They ate dinner at the table instead of in front of the television. On Saturdays, they went to the park near the lake, even in the cold, because Benji had recently become interested in identifying bird species and owned a small pair of binoculars that he wore around his neck with extreme seriousness. Raymond's savings lasted 2 months. Then they started shrinking fast. He picked up a second consulting contract, then a third. He started sleeping less. He started doing the 2 a.m. math at the kitchen table again, adding and subtracting numbers that didn't quite balance no matter how he arranged them. The freelance work was enough to keep them afloat, but not enough to cover Benji's upcoming inhaler's prescription, which the insurance, which Raymond was now paying for out of pocket on a COBRA plan, covered, at a rate that felt deliberately designed to be insulting. One afternoon in March, he drove to a pawnshop on the north side of the city and sold the watch that Claire had given him for their 10th wedding anniversary. It was a simple watch, not expensive, but she had saved for it for 4 months without telling him, and presented it to him over dinner, at a restaurant they couldn't really afford at the time, and he had worn it every day until the day she died. He had not worn it since, but he had kept it in the small wooden box on his dresser, because getting rid of it had always felt like losing something irreplaceable. He got enough for the inhaler prescription, and the electric bill. He did not tell Benji. He was not the kind of man who talked about what he gave up. He had grown up in a household where you handled things quietly and moved on, where struggle was something you managed privately, because burdening other people with it felt like weakness. It wasn't a healthy philosophy, and Raymond knew that. Claire had spent years gently, persistently trying to teach him that asking for help was not the same as failing. He had understood this intellectually. He had not quite learned it in his body yet. What he hadn't known was that someone had been watching. North Point Medical Devices did not collapse when Raymond left, but it wobbled. The new cardiac monitor, the one with the sensor calibration flaw Raymond had documented in the 12-page report that Stafford had glanced at for 45 seconds, had made it to pre-production. And then, 6 weeks after Raymond's termination, during a demonstration for a group of hospital procurement directors from 3 regional health systems, the monitor produced incorrect readings on 2 consecutive test cycles. One of the procurement directors, a woman with 30 years of clinical experience, asked a very specific technical question about the calibration logic under low battery conditions. Nobody in the room could answer it. The meeting ended early. The contracts, 3 contracts representing over $40 million in potential revenue, were placed on hold pending an independent technical review. Stafford called an emergency engineering meeting. The engineers stared at their laptops and said nothing useful because the one person who actually understood the problem had not been in the building for 6 weeks. Genevieve Marsh had built North Point Medical Devices over 22 years from a 2-person startup operating out of a rented office near O'Hare into a company that employed 430 people and held patents on 7 different medical technologies. She was 51 years old, precise in her thinking and demanding in her expectations, and she had a reputation in the industry for being someone you did not want to disappoint. Her engineers feared her in the professional sense. She asked hard questions and remembered every answer, but they also knew she was rigorous in a way that meant something. She didn't cut corners. She had built the company on the principle that when a device goes into a hospital, it has to work. When the cardiac monitor situation landed on her desk on a Friday afternoon, Genevieve read Raymond's original report, the 12-page one that Stafford had buried, in its entirety. She read it twice. Then she pulled Raymond's full personnel file and read that too. When she finished, she sat in her office for a long time without speaking to anyone. She had not known Raymond had submitted that report. She had not known Stafford had dismissed it. She had not known, until she looked at the file carefully, that Raymond had been raising engineering concerns, through formal channels, for over a year before the termination. Concerns that had been consistently deprioritized by mid-level management, in the interest of keeping the product timeline intact. She had been the one who set the timeline. She had not known what it had cost. She got Raymond's home address from HR and told her assistant she would be unreachable for the evening. It was raining when she found the building, a 6-story apartment complex, in a neighborhood that was solidly working class. The kind of building where the buzzers in the lobby panel had handwritten name tags on some of them, and the elevator took a long time. She stood in the lobby for a moment, her coat damp at the shoulders, and thought about what she was going to say. She had negotiated licensing deals, and navigated FDA enforcement actions, and fired people who needed to be fired and hired people who changed the company's direction. She had done all of it with a clear head and a clear script. She did not have a script for this. She knocked on the door to apartment 4C, and Raymond opened it with a dish towel over his shoulder, and an expression of pure confusion. He looked different than she remembered. She had seen him in meetings, always in the background, always the one with his head down over a technical drawing while other people argued about timelines. Here he looked, Not smaller, exactly, more real. He was wearing a flannel shirt, and there was flour on his wrist from what appeared to be some kind of baking project, and from somewhere inside the apartment came the sound of a television and a child's voice narrating something with great enthusiasm. "Mrs. Marsh," he said. "Raymond," she said, "I'd like to talk to you, if that's all right." He studied her for a moment the way engineers study things, not with hostility but with the specific attention of someone assessing a situation carefully before committing to a response.
"Come in," he said.
The apartment was not what she expected. She had expected something that looked like a transitional space, the temporary arrangement of a man between situations. Instead, it was clearly a home. A real one, full of the accumulated evidence of a life that mattered. Drawings on the refrigerator, held up by a mismatched collection of magnets. A bookshelf that mixed engineering textbooks with children's chapter books and 2 large field guides to North American birds. A pair of small sneakers by the door, one with the Velcro tab hanging loose. A cardboard science fair display board propped against the wall, with the heading "The Water Cycle," written in green marker, in the careful handwriting of a child, who was still learning how to make letters the right size. And then Benji came around the corner from the hallway, still holding the television remote, and stopped when he saw Genevieve. He looked at her with the frank, uncomplicated curiosity of an 8-year-old who had not yet learned to pretend he wasn't looking at someone. "Are you my dad's friend?" he asked. Genevieve did not have a ready answer for that. She looked at the boy, at the crease between his eyebrows that matched his father's exactly, at the binoculars still hanging around his neck even inside the apartment, at the matter-of-fact way he was waiting for her answer. And something in her chest did something she hadn't felt in a long time. "I hope so," she said. "I'm working on it." Benji considered this a perfectly reasonable answer and went back to his television program. Raymond brought her coffee at the kitchen table. She told him about the cardiac monitor failure. She told him about the procurement directors, the contracts on hold, the engineers who couldn't answer the question she should have been asking 14 months ago. She told him she had read his full report. Raymond listened without expression. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "I submitted that report through the proper channel," he said. "Nobody was interested." "I know," Genevieve said. "That's on me." He didn't argue with that, which she respected. "I want you to come back," she said, "to fix the calibration issue, full restoration of your position, retroactive pay for the last 6 weeks and a restructured reporting line that goes directly to me, not through Stafford." Raymond looked at his coffee cup. Outside the window, rain moved down the glass in slow, uneven lines. "I appreciate that," he said. "But I've spent the last 6 weeks having breakfast with my son every morning, and picking him up from school every afternoon. He doesn't sit at the window anymore waiting for me to show up. I'm not sure I want to go back to being the person who gave that up." Genevieve didn't answer immediately. She looked around the kitchen, at the water cycle project on the wall, at the drawing of a cardinal taped above the light switch, at the small blue inhaler sitting on the counter, next to a notepad covered in Raymond's handwriting, that she recognized, from 14 years of engineering documentation. She thought about the watch. She didn't know about the watch, not yet. She would learn about it later, and it would stay with her for a long time. But even without knowing about it, she understood something sitting at that kitchen table that she had not understood before she knocked on the door of apartment 4C. She had built a company that rewarded people for disappearing into it. She had set the conditions that made a man like Raymond believe that the only way to keep doing good work was to stop going home. She had thought of that as ambition. She was beginning to think it was something else. "I don't want to offer you your old job back," she said. "I want to offer you a different one." Raymond looked up. "Head of Product Integrity," she said. "You report to me. You set the engineering review standards for every product in development. You have final sign-off authority on any safety concern that gets raised, including ones that conflict with the timeline. Your hours are protected. 4 days a week, home by 4:30. Benefits for you and Benji, full coverage." She paused. "And I want to redesign how the company handles safety reports, starting with yours, as the first case study. So this does happen to the next person." Raymond was quiet for a long moment. "That's a serious change," he said. "I've been running this company for 22 years, Genevieve said. "I'm good at it. but there are things I haven't been paying attention to. That's going to change. From the other room came the sound of Benji explaining something to himself at considerable volume. Something about the migratory patterns of a particular bird, delivered with the confidence of someone who has recently read a great deal about a subject and needs to organize it out loud. Raymond almost smiled. Not quite. But almost. I'll think about it, he said. Genevieve nodded and stood, retrieving her coat from the chair. She was at the apartment door when she turned back. The report you wrote, she said, the 12-page one, I want you to know, it was exactly right. Every single finding. The engineer who wrote that report is the person we need making decisions about what goes out our door. She paused. I'm sorry it took me this long to read it. Raymond looked at her for a moment across the small entryway of apartment 4C, with its loose door chain, its coat hooks that held one adult coat, and one small blue child's jacket with a spaceship on the back. I'll let you know by Friday, he said. She nodded and left. That night, Raymond helped Benji finish the water cycle poster. They used blue glitter glue for the ocean and cotton balls for the clouds, and Benji was insistent that the arrows indicating evaporation had to curve in exactly the right direction, which required 3 attempts and the better part of a bottle of glue. They worked at the kitchen table until almost 9 o'clock, long past Benji's usual bedtime, and when Raymond finally carried the poster carefully to a flat surface to dry, Benji was already half asleep on the couch. Raymond sat at the kitchen table afterward with a cup of tea and a notepad, but this time he wasn't doing the 2 a.m. math. He was thinking about Genevieve's face when Benji had asked if she was his friend, the way it had changed, just briefly, before she answered. The way she had looked around the apartment as if she were seeing something she hadn't expected to see. He thought about the 12-page report, sitting in a drawer somewhere at North Point for 14 months. He thought about the procurement directors who had asked the right question, and the room full of engineers who couldn't answer it. He thought about the patients who would eventually use that cardiac monitor. Real people in real hospital beds, the way Claire had been a real person in a real hospital bed, and the device attached to her arm had beeped steadily and reassuringly right up until the moment it mattered most. That was the thing that had always driven him, not the company, not the title. The fact that the work, done right, kept people safe. He thought about Benji's binoculars, the cotton ball clouds on the water cycle poster, the way Benji had run at him across the schoolyard that first afternoon, full speed, no hesitation. He called Genevieve on Thursday, 1 day early. He had conditions. She accepted all of them. The conversation took 11 minutes. Raymond returned to North Point on a Monday morning, 3 months after they had walked him out with a cardboard box and a deactivated badge. He fixed the cardiac monitor calibration issue in 4 days, the same problem a room full of engineers had failed to solve in 6 weeks. Because he had understood the flaw precisely, since the first day he had documented it, in the 12-page report, that nobody had read. The procurement directors were invited back. The contracts were reinstated, but something larger also changed, more slowly and more importantly. Genevieve restructured the safety reporting system. Engineers who raised formal concerns were guaranteed a documented response within 2 weeks, and a direct line of escalation if that response was inadequate. Stafford's role was reorganized in a way that removed him from product decisions entirely, which was a polite solution to a problem that could have been handled less politely. 3 employees who had left the company in the previous 2 years, people who, it turned out, had also raised concerns that had been buried, were contacted directly, and 2 of them returned. Raymond worked 4 days a week, and was home by 4:30. He was at the school gate every afternoon, reliably, in the way that Benji had stopped daring to count on and was now slowly learning to trust again. That part took time. Trust, once shaken in a child, rebuilds carefully, on its own schedule, not anyone else's. Raymond understood this and didn't rush it. He showed up every day and waited for Benji to stop watching the parking lot from the window. He stopped watching sometime in April. Raymond noticed the exact day, because he had been watching for it. Genevieve came to Benji's science fair in March. This was not discussed or arranged in advance. She mentioned she would try to come, and Raymond had told Benji that a colleague might stop by, and then she was there, in a room full of third-grade science projects, wearing a blazer that cost more than most of the display tables, looking slightly uncertain in a way that Raymond had not seen in any of the 14 years he'd worked in her building. Benji showed her the water cycle poster with the exacting arrows and the cotton ball clouds, and explained, at considerable length, the difference between condensation and precipitation. She listened to all of it. She asked 2 follow-up questions, both of which were genuine. Benji decided she was all right. She won him over completely 2 weeks later, when she mentioned, in passing, that she had once seen a painted bunting in a park in Miami, which is a bird of such extravagant coloring that Benji considered anyone who had seen one in person to be a person of serious distinction. He made her describe it 4 times from different angles. Neither Raymond nor Genevieve was under any illusion that what was forming between them was simple or without complication. Both of them had spent years building walls that looked like competence, his made of long hours and forward motion, hers made of authority and controlled distance. Walls that had protected them from hard things, also from good ones. Taking them down wasn't a single moment. It was a long, uncertain process with bad days, and awkward pauses, and several conversations that started off about work, and became about something else entirely. Which surprised them both each time. But it was real. And real, they were both learning, was worth more than the version of safety that keeps everything out. On an evening in late spring, Raymond and Benji were at the lake park for the Saturday birdwalk when Raymond's phone buzzed with a message from Genevieve. She was nearby. She could stop by if that was okay. She had just seen what she thought might be a yellow warbler, but was prepared to be corrected. He texted back one word. Come. She found them on the bench near the water, Benji with his binoculars aimed at a tree line, with the intense focus of a small scientist, Raymond with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching the light come down over the lake. She sat down on the bench beside him without a lot of ceremony. After a moment, Benji lowered the binoculars and held them out to her without looking away from the trees. You can look, he said. But be quiet. They can tell. Genevieve took the binoculars carefully and looked at the trees. Raymond looked at the water. The city moved behind them, indifferent and constant. The strongest people are not the ones who never needed anything. They are the ones who finally admitted what they needed, and then built a life around that truth, instead of in spite of it.